The Alpha King married a stranger, only to discover the rejected Omega was his true mate. Before we begin, imagine this. Somewhere in a forgotten corner of the kingdom, a gentle Omega is about to make a choice that no one else would make. While others choose fear, she chooses kindness. While others walk away, she stays. Because in this world, kindness is never weakness. It is the beginning of every legend. Sometimes, the smallest act of compassion can change a destiny in ways no one could ever imagine. If you love emotional Alpha King and Omega stories where kindness is stronger than power, loyalty is worth more than pride, and forgotten Omegas become legends, you've found the perfect place. Please subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin today's unforgettable story. The vows had barely left the Alpha King's lips when his wolf awakened for a woman who wasn't standing beside him. Dawn spread pale silver across the towering spires of Northreach Palace, washing the ancient fortress in a cold light that couldn't soften the burden resting upon every soul gathered inside its walls. Hundreds of wolves from the great packs filled the marble courtyard, their polished armor and ceremonial cloaks transforming the royal wedding into a symbol of hard-earned peace after years of bloodshed. At the center stood Alpha King Kieran Whitaker, tall, motionless. His expression revealed neither excitement nor regret, only the discipline of a ruler who had learned long ago that duty often demanded more than the heart could willingly give. Across from him, Madeline Brooks met his gaze with quiet dignity. She understood better than anyone that this marriage had been built by treaties rather than affection. Together, they represented stability, nothing more. When the High Elder pronounced them husband and wife, applause rolled through the courtyard like distant thunder. Neither of them smiled. As nobles stepped forward to celebrate the union, Kieran suddenly hesitated. Not because of doubt, not because of fear. Something felt wrong. A faint, unfamiliar restlessness stirred beneath years of perfect self-control. Before he could understand it, the massive palace gates burst open. Exhausted riders crossed the bridge, escorting wagons filled with villagers injured by a devastating landslide along the eastern border. Guards rushed aside as healers hurried toward the wounded, lifting frightened children, elderly survivors, and injured workers onto waiting stretchers. Among the healers walked a young woman wrapped in a faded gray cloak dusted with dried herbs from days of travel. She never looked toward the royal ceremony. Her attention remained entirely on the wounded. Few people noticed her. Those who did saw nothing remarkable. Only another anonymous Omega assigned to the border medical caravan. Sienna Mercer preferred it that way. The less attention she attracted, the safer her life remained. Years earlier, another crowd had watched her future collapse beneath public rejection, teaching her that hope could vanish without warning. Since then, she had stopped expecting anyone to truly see her. She knelt beside a frightened little boy trapped beneath part of a broken cart, speaking quietly enough for his panicked breathing to slow. Around them, chaos continued without pause. No one paid attention to the strange stillness that briefly settled wherever she moved. High above the courtyard, Kieran turned almost absent-mindedly toward the commotion. His eyes found her. Not her face, not her clothing, her presence. The instant he saw the unknown healer, something deep inside him, his wolf, surged awake with frightening force. A wave of heat struck his chest so suddenly that his breath caught. His pulse hammered. Every instinct urged him to walk toward the woman standing among complete strangers. He tightened his hand around the ceremonial ring he had placed upon Madeline's finger only moments before. The feeling disappeared almost immediately, leaving behind only silence, confusion, and a question he could not answer. Kieran slowly released his grip, forcing himself to look away. Months of negotiations, years of responsibility, countless battles. None of them had ever shaken his instincts like a single glance at an unknown Omega. He dismissed the sensation as exhaustion. He had no other explanation. Without another thought, Sienna disappeared into the palace infirmary alongside the other healers, completely unaware that the Alpha King had noticed her at all. Watching from the shadowed balcony above, Lord Wesley Grant remained perfectly still. His face betrayed nothing. Only the slight tightening of one gloved hand hinted that something carefully buried years earlier might have just begun to surface. Far below, The wedding celebration continued exactly as the kingdom expected, but unseen beneath the music, applause, and carefully rehearsed smiles, destiny had already taken its first breath. Sienna Mercer expected suspicion the moment the palace attendants learned she was an Omega, but she had forgotten how quickly old wounds could reopen when whispered judgment echoed through polished corridors instead of dusty village streets. The royal infirmary stretched across a quiet wing overlooking the eastern gardens, its shelves lined with dried roots, crystal vials, and carefully catalogued remedies collected over generations. While other healers unpacked supplies from the border convoy, Sienna moved from bed to bed with practiced calm, cleaning torn flesh, soothing frightened children, and speaking gently enough to quiet panic before medicine ever touched a wound. Her work was nearly invisible, yet impossible to ignore. Dr. Maeve Dalton watched from across the chamber without interruption, her experienced eyes lingering not on Sienna's hands, but on the remarkable stillness that settled wherever the young woman stopped. Wolves recovering from fever relaxed without explanation. Patients struggling through painful treatments steadied their breathing after hearing only a few reassuring words. Even restless guards assigned to protect injured nobles seemed less tense whenever she passed nearby. The peace she carried felt natural rather than theatrical, and that alone made Maeve curious. Curiosity, however, was not shared by everyone. Before sunset, several palace servants discovered the faded rejection scar beneath Sienna's collar while she reached for fresh bandages. Their conversation fell silent for only a heartbeat before sharp glances replaced polite smiles. One whispered that no respectable pack would cast aside an Omega without reason. Another suggested she must have brought disgrace upon herself. By the next hour, rumors drifted through the infirmary more quickly than smoke. No accusation was spoken to her face, yet every lowered voice carried enough meaning. Sienna accepted each cutting glance with quiet dignity, refusing to defend a past that had never been understood in the first place. She had exhausted those arguments years ago. Somewhere beyond the infirmary walls, Kieran struggled to focus during the first council meeting after his wedding. Noble representatives debated border security, grain distribution, and military alliances, yet every discussion dissolved into distant noise whenever an unfamiliar calm brushed against his senses. Nathaniel Pierce noticed the king's distraction immediately. Kieran rarely lost concentration, particularly during matters affecting the realm. When asked for a decision regarding patrol routes, he answered several moments too late, surprising even himself. Frustration tightened his jaw. Nothing in recent memory had unsettled his instincts this way, and he refused to believe a passing encounter with an unknown healer could explain it. He dismissed the sensation as lingering fatigue, though the explanation satisfied neither his mind nor the wolf hidden beneath disciplined restraint. As twilight settled over Northreach, commotion erupted inside the infirmary. A young wolf recovering from crushing injuries awoke in blind terror after reliving the landslide that had buried his family. Order dissolved instantly. Several attendants failed to restrain him as panic spread through neighboring patients, triggering instinctive reactions among nearby wolves. Before guards could intervene, Sienna crossed the room without haste. She knelt several steps away from the frightened boy instead of forcing him down, meeting his tear-filled eyes with steady compassion. Her voice floated through the chamber like the first gentle rain after unbearable heat. She spoke no ancient spell, offered no command, only simple reassurance that he was safe, that no falling stone could reach him now, that he did not have to carry fear alone. One breath became two. Trembling eased. Clenched fists slowly relaxed. Around them, the entire infirmary fell into astonishing stillness. Even the anxious wolves surrounding the bed lowered their heads as though responding to a forgotten memory older than language itself. Dr. Maeve's expression hardened, not with alarm, but recognition she dared not voice aloud. At nearly that same instant, Kieran halted mid-conversation in a distant hallway, struck by the unmistakable feeling that something inside him had answered a call no one else could hear. Unable to explain the invisible pull any longer, he quietly excused himself from the council chamber and began walking toward the infirmary, unaware that every step carried him closer to the woman he had already tried to convince himself meant nothing. By the time Kieran reached the royal infirmary, The fearful chaos had already dissolved into an almost sacred silence. The young patient who had moments earlier fought against every helping hand now rested peacefully, his breathing slow, and even while Sienna remained beside him, one hand lightly covering the child's trembling fingers. She looked exhausted rather than triumphant, as though offering comfort demanded more from her than anyone realized. Kieran stopped just beyond the doorway, careful not to interrupt. Something about the quiet healer unsettled him in a way no battlefield ever had. His instincts urged him forward, yet years of discipline held him in place. Dr. Maeve Dalton noticed the king before anyone else. She stepped toward him with respectful composure, though curiosity flickered behind her calm expression. "The boy will recover," she said softly. "Your Majesty has nothing to fear." Kieran nodded, but his attention remained fixed on Sienna. "She calmed an entire room," he observed. "How?" Maeve chose her words carefully. "Some healers possess gifts that medicine alone cannot explain. I would advise patience before reaching conclusions." It was not an answer, but it was enough to deepen the questions already forming inside him. Before Kieran could speak again, Sienna finally sensed another presence and turned toward the entrance. Their eyes met for the first time without crowds, ceremonies, or confusion separating them. She immediately recognized the man standing before her as the Alpha King, whose wedding had filled the kingdom with celebration only a day earlier. Respectfully lowering her gaze, she offered a simple bow instead of the elaborate gestures expected in court. "Your Majesty." Her voice remained steady, carrying neither admiration nor resentment. Kieran found himself unexpectedly relieved that she treated him like any other patient she might someday encounter. "You handled the situation remarkably," he replied. "The palace owes you its gratitude." Sienna answered with a faint smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. The child needed reassurance, not praise for the healer. Without waiting for further acknowledgement, she returned to organizing clean linens and herbal mixtures. The conversation ended before it had truly begun, leaving Kieran with the unfamiliar sensation of having been dismissed without disrespect. As he walked away, Nathaniel Pierce quietly joined him in the corridor. "You visited this wing twice today," the beta remarked with a knowing glance. "That's unusual." Kieran offered no immediate reply. After several silent steps, he finally admitted, "Something feels unfinished whenever she's nearby." Nathaniel studied his friend's expression with growing concern. He had witnessed the king's composure through wars, betrayals, and political crises. This uncertainty was entirely new. "Would you like me to learn more about her?" he asked. Kieran hesitated only briefly before nodding. Discreetly, "I want facts, nothing more." Nathaniel accepted the task without another question. Meanwhile, Sienna carried a basket of fresh herbs into the palace gardens to replenish the infirmary's dwindling supply. Away from curious eyes, she allowed herself a slow breath. Meeting the king had awakened memories she preferred buried. Years earlier, another alpha had once spoken to her with kindness before deciding she was unworthy when expectation outweighed compassion. Gideon Shaw's public rejection had taught her never to mistake courtesy for trust. She refused to become entangled in another powerful man's life, especially one already bound by vows to someone else. Across the gardens, Queen Madeline watched from an upper terrace. She had observed Kieran's brief visit through the tall windows overlooking the infirmary and recognized something subtle in her husband's posture that had never appeared during their carefully arranged courtship. It was not desire. It was recognition struggling against reason. Madeline understood political marriages better than most, but she also understood that certain silences carried greater meaning than spoken declarations. Later that evening, as Nathaniel searched old palace registries for records concerning the healer from the border convoy, one incomplete document caught his attention. Most of the page had been deliberately altered years before, leaving only a partially preserved family name, Mercer, and a faded royal seal marked for restricted review. Before he could examine it further, another hand quietly closed the archive ledger. Wesley Grant smiled with practiced courtesy, his eyes revealing nothing. "Some records exist for history," he said evenly, "and some remain buried because kingdoms survive only when certain stories are never finished." Nathaniel held the minister's gaze without answering, but as Wesley carried the damaged file away, The beta realized someone had been protecting a secret long before Sienna Mercer ever walked through the palace gates. The uneased Nathaniel carried from the royal archives followed him into the Hall of Pax the next morning, where Northreach's most influential alphas gathered beneath towering stone pillars to renew their loyalty to the crown. Kieran presided over the assembly with the calm authority expected of a ruler, while Queen Madeline occupied her place beside him, dignified despite the quiet distance neither could disguise. Hidden among advisors and nobles, Wesley Grant watched every exchange with measured patience, as though waiting for an inevitable move in a game only he understood. At the rear of the chamber, Dr. Maeve escorted several healers assigned to remain available should any elder require assistance during the lengthy proceedings. Sienna walked with them carrying only a satchel of remedies, hoping to remain unnoticed until the gathering ended. That hope vanished the instant Gideon Shaw entered the hall. The Alpha of Greyhaven recognized her immediately, disbelief flashing across his face before curling into open contempt. "So this is where forgotten Omegas come to hide," he remarked loudly enough for nearby nobles to hear. Conversations faded. Curious eyes turned toward Sienna. She remained composed, refusing to answer the insult. Gideon stepped closer, his voice growing colder. "You should have stayed where rejected wolves belong. A royal court is no place for failures." The familiar words struck old scars without breaking her composure. She had survived worse than public humiliation. Dr. Maeve attempted to intervene, but Gideon lifted his chin, asserting the dominance expected of an alpha over an omega from his former territory. Invisible pressure rolled across the chamber like an approaching storm. Several attendants instinctively lowered their eyes. Sienna's knees trembled beneath the force pressing against her instincts, yet she fought to remain standing. Murmurs spread through the gathering. Some believed submission was inevitable. Others simply watched. From the throne, Kieran saw the strain crossing Sienna's face before he fully understood why anger ignited inside him with terrifying speed. His wolf surged against every restraint, rejecting the scene unfolding before him. Without conscious thought, Kieran descended the dais, each measured step silencing another corner of the chamber until only his boots echoed across the marble floor. Gideon noticed too late. Just as Sienna's strength began to falter, Kieran placed himself between them. The crushing alpha pressure vanished as though striking an immovable mountain. "She stands under my protection while she serves this kingdom," Kieran said, his voice controlled but carrying unquestionable authority. "No one will force her to kneel." Shock rippled through the nobles. Gideon stiffened, unwilling to challenge the king openly, yet unable to conceal his resentment. Sienna looked up in stunned silence, confusion replacing exhaustion. The instant her gaze met Kieran's from only a few feet away, a sudden warmth spread beneath the silver pendant resting against her chest. Hidden beneath her clothing, the crescent-shaped heirloom shimmered faintly. At the same moment, a sharp pulse radiated through Kieran's chest, so powerful that he instinctively reached toward his heart. Neither touched the other, yet something unseen answered across the small distance separating them. Dr. Maeve witnessed both reactions, and every trace of color drained from her face. She had studied forgotten accounts preserved in forbidden medical journals decades earlier. She knew that ordinary attraction could never awaken an ancient bond sealed before either soul understood its own destiny. Wesley noticed Maeve's expression and quietly tightened his gloved hand. For the first time since Sienna arrived at Northreach, genuine concern flickered behind his carefully constructed composure. The seal he believed permanent had responded. Before anyone else could question the strange silence hanging over the hall, Kieran ordered the ceremony suspended and escorted Sienna away from the gathering himself, leaving the assembled leaders exchanging uneasy glances. Behind them, Gideon watched with growing hostility, while Maeve realized the impossible could no longer remain hidden. Somewhere deep beneath years of forgotten deception, a bond that should never have survived had just awakened, and its next revelation would change far more than the fate of two lives. The silence that followed the interrupted council settled over Northreach like an approaching storm, lingering long after the nobles had withdrawn from the Hall of Pax. Kieran escorted Sienna to a private chamber adjoining the infirmary, posting guards outside not to confine her, but to ensure no one else could reach her without permission. She faced him across the room with quiet restraint, unsettled less by Gideon's cruelty than by the king's unexpected defense. "You should return to your queen," she said gently. "One moment of compassion is already enough to fuel dangerous rumors." Kieran held her gaze, searching for words that duty had never required him to learn. "If I had remained on that dais, I would have betrayed more than my crown." Sienna lowered her eyes. "Then protect your kingdom. Don't protect me because your instincts refuse to stay silent." Before either could continue, Dr. Maeve arrived carrying an aged wooden chest sealed with the royal healer's crest. She requested privacy, waiting until even the guard stepped outside before placing the box upon the table. Inside rested brittle records untouched for decades beside a faded sketch of an unfamiliar crest. As Sienna instinctively removed the silver crescent pendant from beneath her clothing, Maeve froze. The engraving inside the pendant matched the forgotten symbol precisely. "Moonbound," Maeve whispered, unable to conceal her astonishment. "I believe this bloodline disappeared before the last succession war." Sienna admitted she knew almost nothing beyond what her late mother had chosen to tell her, that the pendant must never be surrendered, regardless of who demanded it. Maeve carefully unfolded another fragile document bearing evidence of deliberate alterations. Someone had erased entire branches of lineage connected to the Mercer family, replacing names with false records approved under restricted authority. Nathaniel entered moments later carrying his own troubling discovery. Before Wesley removed the archive ledger, Nathaniel had copied part of a damaged registry showing that Sienna's birth record had once been classified alongside candidates monitored by the Crown itself. The dates matched perfectly before vanishing from official history. Kieran listened in silence as scattered fragments formed an unsettling picture. None of it explained why his wolf responded so fiercely to Sienna, but it proved one undeniable truth. Her past had been hidden intentionally. Sienna's pulse quickened. For years she had accepted rejection as personal failure, yet every new revelation suggested forces beyond her understanding had shaped her life long before Gideon publicly cast her aside. Even so, she refused to build hope upon unanswered questions. "Hidden records don't change who I am," she said quietly. "They don't erase your marriage or repair the choices already made." Her words struck Kieran harder than accusation would have. He had entered that wedding-believing sacrifice was the price of peace. Now every certainty felt increasingly fragile. As evening descended, the palace gardens lay beneath a bright rising moon. Sienna stepped outside seeking solitude, clutching her pendant while memories of her mother's final warning echoed within her heart. When the silver moon calls, trust actions before promises. She scarcely noticed Kieran approaching until he stopped several paces away, careful not to invade the distance she clearly needed. Neither reached for the other. Neither spoke. Yet as moonlight touched the pendant, its engraved crescent glowed with a soft silver radiance unseen since Clara Mercer had last held it. At the same instant, a searing warmth spread beneath Kieran's ribs, forcing him to steady himself against a stone column. The invisible barrier suppressing whatever bound them fractured with startling force. A rush of unfamiliar emotions swept through them both: grief, longing, recognition, and an overwhelming certainty that defied reason. Sienna staggered back, gripping the pendant as tears filled her eyes without explanation. Kieran felt his wolf bow its head in complete acceptance, no longer searching but knowing. Dr. Maeve, watching unseen from an upper balcony, closed her eyes in solemn realization. The ancient restraint had begun to fail. The truth could no longer remain hidden, because the bond had awakened beyond anyone's ability to silence it. Somewhere in the shadows, Wesley Grant observed the silver light reflecting across the garden and immediately summoned a trusted messenger. His carefully protected deception had reached its breaking point. Before dawn arrived, every remaining piece on the board would begin moving, and none of their lives, including the king's, could ever return to what they had been before that moonlit night. Before dawn, Northreach felt quieter than it ever had after a victory. The palace corridors were still, yet no one truly rested. Kieran remained alone inside the council chamber, staring at the extinguished candles surrounding the throne. Every law he had spent his life defending suddenly seemed to stand against the truth he could no longer deny. Across the palace, Sienna folded her worn cloak and carefully placed the silver crescent pendant back beneath her collar. She had already decided to leave before sunrise. She would not become the reason a kingdom questioned its king or humiliated a queen who had shown her nothing but kindness. As she crossed the eastern courtyard with only a small satchel in hand, Nathaniel stepped from the shadows. "If you leave now," he said quietly, "someone else will write your story." He handed her a weathered parchment recovered from an abandoned royal vault. It carried Clara Mercer's handwriting. With trembling fingers, Sienna read the final message her mother had left behind. Clara warned that the moonbound bloodline had been hidden because powerful men feared the day a destined alpha could no longer be controlled through politics. She begged whoever found the letter to remember one truth above all else: never mistake silence for safety. Sienna closed her eyes, holding the paper against her heart before carefully folding it away. Footsteps echoed across the stone. Wesley Grant approached with several royal guards, his expression as composed as ever. "For your own protection," he announced smoothly, "I recommend you remain inside the palace until these matters are settled." Sienna recognized the trap hidden beneath the courtesy. Before she could answer, Kieran entered the courtyard. His gaze moved from Wesley to the guards and finally to Sienna's packed satchel. "She goes where she chooses," he said evenly. Wesley offered a respectful bow, but the brief tightening around his eyes betrayed irritation. "Your Majesty," he replied, "the council may interpret such freedom as favoritism." Kieran never looked away from Sienna. "Then the council may question me instead of her." The minister withdrew without argument, though Nathaniel watched him disappear with growing suspicion. Later that afternoon, Madeline invited Sienna to the palace conservatory. Sunlight filtered through tall glass panels, while white lilies swayed gently in the breeze. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Finally, Sienna broke the silence. "I never wanted to stand between you and your husband." Madeline's smile carried quiet sadness rather than resentment. "You never did." She traced a finger across a blooming lily before continuing. "Kieran and I respected one another. That was enough for peace, but never enough for love." She met Sienna's eyes. "Don't carry guilt that belongs to people who hid the truth." Those words lingered long after they parted. That evening, Dr. Maeve completed her examination of the silver pendant. She carefully placed it beneath a beam of moonlight spilling through the infirmary window. Fine engravings invisible to the naked eye slowly emerged across the surface. "This pendant wasn't created to unite mates," she whispered. "It was forged to keep them apart until the seal failed." Kieran's heartbeat quickened. The strange pull he had resisted since the wedding was never an illusion. Someone had delayed it for years. Before anyone could absorb the revelation, heavy knocks shook the infirmary doors. A royal messenger entered carrying a sealed summons stamped with every Great Pack's crest. Gideon Shaw had formally demanded a public tribunal, accusing Sienna of manipulating the Alpha King through forbidden influence. The hearing would begin at first light, before the entire kingdom. Nathaniel reached instinctively for his sword. Maeve lowered her head in troubled silence. Kieran stepped toward Sienna, ready to forbid the trial outright. She gently stopped him with a single shake of her head. "If I hide now," she said softly, "they'll believe every lie ever told about me." She lifted her chin, slipped the pendant beneath her cloak once more, and accepted the summons with steady hands. By choosing to face the council herself, Sienna surrendered the last chance to escape. Whatever waited inside the Moonstone Hall would decide far more than her future. It would determine whether truth still had a place in Northreach at all. By sunrise, every road leading to Northreach was crowded with wolves answering the High Council's summons. Beneath the cracked Moonstone Dome, the kingdom gathered not to celebrate a king, but to judge a woman who had arrived with nothing except a healer's satchel and a reputation she never deserved. Sienna entered the chamber without lowering her head. Across the hall, Gideon Shaw stood ready to testify, while Wesley Grant waited beside the council with the calm confidence of a man convinced he still controlled the truth. Kieran watched from the royal platform, every instinct urging him to intervene before the proceedings even began. Yet he remembered Sienna's words from the night before. If I hide now, they'll believe every lie ever told about me. This battle had to become hers before it could become his. Gideon addressed the council first. He declared that Sienna had always been unstable, claiming her unusual abilities were evidence of forbidden influence rather than healing. He insisted that ever since her arrival, the king had abandoned reason and endangered the realm. Several council members nodded uneasily. Then Sienna asked for permission to speak. The chamber fell silent. She did not deny being rejected. She did not deny that the king had changed after meeting her. Instead, she calmly removed the silver pendant from around her neck and placed it upon the council table. "If this object created the bond," she said quietly, "destroy it now." No one moved. Dr. Maeve stepped forward instead. Opening ancient moonbound records before every witness, she explained that the pendant had never forged destiny. It had restrained it. Nathaniel followed by presenting the recovered royal registries together with Clara Mercer's handwritten testimony, proving that Sienna's bloodline had been erased decades earlier under sealed authority. Wesley immediately dismissed the documents as forged, but Sienna asked one final question that changed everything. "If my family never mattered," she asked while looking directly at him, "why were official records altered before I was old enough to speak?" The silence that followed was far more damaging than any accusation. Nathaniel then revealed the final piece of evidence, a preserved authorization bearing Wesley's personal seal approving the removal of the Mercer lineage from the royal succession archives. Gasps swept through the chamber. Kieran stared at the document before looking toward Sienna. In that instant, he understood the full weight of what had been stolen from her. She had not lost her future because she was unworthy. Powerful men had decided her life was expendable long before she ever met him. The realization struck harder than any battlefield wound. Before Wesley could recover, Queen Madeleine stepped away from the royal dais. Every eye followed her as she crossed the chamber and stopped beside Sienna instead of beside the throne. "I entered this marriage believing it would preserve peace," she said clearly. "Peace built upon lies deserves to fall." Her words shattered the last illusion that this was merely a dispute between rivals. Even several council elders lowered their eyes in shame. Cornered at last, Wesley abandoned pretense. He admitted that the moonbound bloodline had been hidden because no council could control a kingdom once a true alpha and true mate stood together beyond political influence. "Stability always demands sacrifice," he declared. One forgotten Omega was a small price to pay. Kieran descended from the platform, his voice carrying through the stunned chamber. "You did not protect this kingdom," he said. "You robbed it of truth." Royal guards moved to seize Wesley, but hidden supporters scattered throughout the council suddenly drew concealed weapons. Smoke erupted beneath the shattered dome as chaos consumed the assembly. Wesley escaped through a secret passage prepared long in advance, while loyalists blocked pursuit. By the time the smoke cleared, the minister had vanished beyond the palace walls. A warning horn thundered from the western tower. Scouts raced into the courtyard with desperate news. Wolves still loyal to Wesley were already advancing toward Northreach. Kieran reached instinctively for his sword. Sienna stepped beside him, not behind him. For the first time since they met, they faced the coming storm as equals, knowing the battle ahead would decide not only the fate of their bond, but the future of every pack in the kingdom. The smoke above Northreach had begun to fade, but the silence that followed the battle felt heavier than the fighting itself. Wounded wolves filled the palace infirmary while families searched anxiously for familiar faces. Without waiting for anyone's permission, Sienna returned to the long wooden tables where the injured were being carried. She worked until her hands trembled from exhaustion, cleaning wounds, calming frightened children, and comforting mothers who feared the worst. When a young soldier recognized her as the Omega he had mocked outside the council chamber only days before, shame filled his eyes. "I don't deserve your help," he whispered. Sienna carefully tightened the bandage around his shoulder before offering a gentle smile. "Healing isn't something people earn," she replied. "It's something they need." Around them, conversations slowly fell silent. Those who had once doubted her no longer saw a rejected Omega. They saw the woman who had chosen compassion when resentment would have been easier. Beyond the western gate, Kieran rode alone toward the scattered remnants of Wesley's forces. The truth revealed during the tribunal had already begun to fracture their loyalty, yet fear still kept many from laying down their weapons. Kieran stopped only a short distance from the waiting line of warriors. Without a word, he removed his sword and drove it into the earth before him. Then he stepped away from it. If you believe Wesley protected this kingdom, he called across the valley, take my life now. No one moved. His voice remained calm. But if you know he stole the truth from all of us, don't spill another drop of blood for his lies. The stillness stretched until an aging captain slowly lowered his spear. Tears gathered in his eyes as he looked toward the king. You carried my son home after the river campaign, he said quietly. I won't dishonor that mercy today. One by one, weapons struck the ground. The line dissolved without another battle. Wesley fled into the northern wilderness with only a handful of followers, while the wolves he had manipulated chose to return home instead of continuing a war built upon deception. As dusk settled over the palace, Kieran finally entered the infirmary. He found Sienna asleep beside the bed of an injured child, one hand still resting gently over the little boy's bandaged arm. For several quiet moments, he simply stood there watching her. This was the woman who had changed his kingdom without commanding an army or wearing a crown. When she stirred awake, embarrassment crossed her face. I must have fallen asleep. Kieran smiled softly. For the first time since we met, you stopped trying to carry everyone by yourself. She laughed quietly, the sound gentle enough not to wake the child. It was the first genuine laugh either of them had shared since the wedding that had brought them together. Later that evening, Madeline asked to see them both in the palace garden. Beneath blooming white lilies, she handed Kieran the final document dissolving their marriage before turning to Sienna. Please promise me one thing, she said warmly. Don't spend your life wondering whether you deserve happiness. You already do. Before Sienna could answer, Madeline embraced her as a friend rather than a rival. Watching the two women, Kieran understood that the peace they had fought for had already begun. After Madeline departed, Eleanor quietly approached carrying the silver Luna brooch. She placed it in Sienna's hands instead of fastening it to her cloak. I once believed titles created worthy people, Eleanor admitted. You taught me that worthy people give meaning to titles. She then turned to her son. The rest is no longer for a mother or a council to decide. When they were finally alone, Kieran looked at the brooch resting in Sienna's palm before gently closing her fingers around it. I'm not asking you to wear it, he said. Not now? Maybe not ever. I only want the chance to become the man who deserves to see you choose it yourself. Sienna looked into his eyes for a long moment before quietly nodding. No promise was spoken. None was needed. At that instant, Nathaniel crossed the garden carrying a sealed decree bearing the united crests of every remaining great pack. He handed it to Kieran with a faint smile. The council is waiting, he said. Tomorrow, they won't ask who destiny chose for the Alpha King. His eyes shifted toward Sienna. They'll ask whom he chooses and whether she chooses him in return. At sunrise, the people of Northreach gathered once more beneath the restored Moonstone courtyard. Only months earlier, the same kingdom had witnessed a royal wedding built upon duty, secrecy, and political necessity. This morning felt entirely different. No banners celebrated victory. No musicians announced a ceremony. The silence itself carried greater meaning than any procession ever could. Standing before every great pack, the High Council read its final decree. The marriage between King Kieran Whitaker and Queen Madeline Brooks was officially dissolved, having been founded upon records deliberately falsified by Wesley Grant and those who had protected his deception. The council publicly cleared Madeline of every accusation, honoring her wisdom and integrity before appointing her ambassador to the Allied Pacts, where her gift for diplomacy would continue serving the peace she had helped preserve. She accepted the appointment with quiet grace before embracing Sienna. You never took anything from me, she whispered warmly. You simply found what should never have been lost. Around them, other chapters of the kingdom quietly came to a close. Gideon Shaw formally surrendered his claim to alpha leadership and accepted the council's judgment without resistance. Eleanor Whitaker announced sweeping reforms that abolished the public rejection ceremonies, which had humiliated generations of Omegas, declaring that no wolf's worth would ever again be measured before a crowd. Nathaniel and Dr. Maeve reopened every royal archive Wesley had altered, restoring forgotten bloodlines and returning stolen family histories to those who had been erased. News also arrived that Wesley had been captured near the northern frontier after his remaining followers abandoned him, bringing an end to the conspiracy that had shaped the kingdom for decades. Yet despite the importance of every decree, everyone present waited for only one moment. The council elder turned toward Kieran. "Your Majesty," he announced, "the kingdom recognizes Sienna Mercer as your true mate. Do you accept her as your Luna?" Every eye shifted toward the king. Kieran remained silent for several heartbeats before slowly removing the royal crown from his head. Instead of answering the elder, he stepped down from the platform and walked across the courtyard until he stood before Sienna alone. He placed the crown upon the stone between them, leaving neither throne nor title separating them any longer. "Months ago," he said softly, though every soul present could hear him, "I stood before this kingdom and spoke vows that duty demanded. Today I won't hide behind duty, prophecy, or even destiny." His voice grew steadier. "The bond may have led me to you, but everything that happened afterward was your choice and mine. You taught me that a king earns trust the same way any man does, through honesty, humility, and the courage to change. So I won't ask whether fate says you belong beside me." He offered only his hand. "Sienna Mercer, will you choose to build that future with me?" The courtyard became perfectly still. Sienna looked first at the crown resting on the stone, then at the silver pendant hanging against her heart. She opened its hidden compartment one final time. Inside, beneath her mother's fading handwriting, one final sentence caught the morning light. "Love is never proven by the bond you are born with. It is proven by the choice you make after learning the truth." A peaceful smile crossed her face. She closed the pendant, slipped it beneath her cloak, and gently took Kieran's waiting hand. "I won't stand beside you because you're my true mate," she said. "I'll stand beside you because you're the man you chose to become, and the man I choose to love." For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then applause slowly rose across the courtyard, not the formal applause of a political wedding, but the heartfelt celebration of people witnessing two lives finally freed from lies. Months later, beneath blooming white lilies in the palace gardens, there were no jeweled thrones, no political treaties, and no crowded royal spectacle. Family, friends, healers, and the wolves whose lives they had touched gathered quietly beneath the evening sky as Kieran and Sienna exchanged simple vows. Madeline smiled from the front row. Eleanor watched with peaceful pride. Nathaniel and Maeve laughed together as children ran between the flower beds, while even the palace guards struggled to hide their smiles. When Kieran slipped a simple silver ring onto Sienna's finger, the moon rose above Northreach exactly as it had on the night their forgotten bond first awakened. This time, however, they needed no ancient magic to tell them where they belonged. The Alpha King had once married a stranger because the kingdom demanded it. In the end, he earned the love of the rejected Omega because, after every lie had been uncovered and every crown had been laid aside, they freely chose one another. And that choice became the strongest bond the kingdom had ever known.